I'm at the Red House with Trey Caldwell, old friend of mine. Thank you for coming over and doing this.
You're welcome.
So, best way to jump in, I feel like, is to say, I want to take the opportunity to learn more about your life and your perspective and your whatever, just you, your identity, I guess.
The inner Trey.
The inner Trey. Yes.
Have you read Dante's Inferno?
No, not lately.
Okay.
Is it like that?
It's actually it's more of a psychedelic trip than it is a dark place. It's very scattershot.
Yeah, I've tried to pick up on some of the cliff notes of Dante's Inferno, at least to understand what it is as a work. So I've heard a lot of people talk about the Inferno, but I've never actually read it. There's a lot of classical shit that I can't quite sink my teeth into sometimes due to the language, I guess.
Yeah. It's even the best English translations are a little thick.
Yeah.
I went through a stretch when I got out of high school, and I thought, there's all these books that are considered classics, and we hadn't covered them when I was in school. So I started buying paperbacks and reading through classic books and just, Man of La Mancha and, whatever. I'd go to a bookstore and find something in the classics section and pull it out and take it home and read it. It was a pretty fun thing. I can't say that I've exactly gone through the whole catalog of classical literature, but Dante's Inferno ended up in that bunch, as did Ulysses by James Joyce, which is also a very thick read. It took me a while to understand what he was doing as a novelist when I was reading it, but I ended up not liking the book. Some people think it's wonderful, but it was too clever by half as far as I was concerned. But Inferno is he's taking you. He's designed hell as a series of layers, and what kind of people end up in this layer, and what kind of people end up in that layer. And I'm not a guy that believes in gods and demons, and so it just I didn't find it compelling.
I'm the opposite in that way. Well, not totally opposite, because as far as I can tell, I don't think I'm the type of person that necessarily believes in gods and demons, but I find it really, really compelling for that, despite the fact that it's not necessarily what informs my view of the world these days. I find that symbolism really intoxicating. Really, like I can't not love it for some reason.
There seems to be a compulsion for humans across all civilizations to have a religious understanding of the world. It seems that they, at the very least, they need to understand an incomprehensible world, and a God makes that a lot easier. And I don't think there's not being a God believer doesn't make me think I've got some great advantage in intellect over Christians or other people of faith. I hold them in high regard. Some of the best people I've ever met have been Christians.
That's right. That's actually something I've noticed about you, especially in my more angry atheistic days of expressing that stuff out in the world. Yeah. I remember you being somebody that's was way more sort of not at war with people of faith.
No, I'm not.
Yeah.
I might have to be coming up, but I don't think so. It's going to be really difficult to work through the issue of abortion because the two sides are irresolvable.
Mm.
Either a human is a human at conception or at some other time. But if you believe that we've got a person at conception, it makes perfect sense to me that you would feel a responsibility to protect the life of another human being.
Yeah.
I don't see it that way, but I can understand how you get to that point, and I respect it. On the other hand, I got my a person in a womb becomes a person later than that, from Carl Sagan. It gave me the best thought process I ever saw. And it ends up being right there at the quickening.
The quickening.
When the baby moves.
Ah. When it moves.
Inside the womb.
For the first time?
Yeah. Sure, why not? So you got a fertilized egg, and it ends up appropriately implanting itself. 30% of them don't. At least 30%, as they say. They're just washed out with the next time you flush. The process is not precision, and most of a real chunk of fertilized eggs don't ever implant.
Mm-hmm.
Or they implant in such a way that they don't ever develop, and the woman never knows that she was ever pregnant, if you want to call it that. But then, so we say the fertilized egg implants, and you can call that a fetus, or you can choose to argue with whether it's a fetus. You can call it a baby if you want, but that's the stage you're at. And then in modern times, we're using fetal heartbeat. And fetal heartbeat happens somewhere around 6 or 7 weeks. And they started setting the no abortions after 6 weeks across a bunch of red states. And the real fact is that they may be able to detect an electrical impulse. They can detect an electrical impulse somewhere around 6 or 7 weeks. And then it turns out that the baby or the fetus doesn't have a heart yet. There's literally no heart. There's just an electrical signal. And as the pregnancy progresses, other things happen. And Carl Sagan, he went through all this, but in the end, he went to brains. That a human with no brain isn't really a human yet. And so he was saying that when it turns out that the brain is completing its initial development about 20 to 24 weeks, right what Roe had, and right when the quickening starts. And the quickening has the advantage of being more consistent with Scripture than any other early part of the pregnancy.
With Scripture?
I did the Bible for a lot, but it was a long time ago, and so I can't just call up chapter and verse anymore.
Yeah.
But the Scripture in several places talks about the quickening as when the human forms, but it's not a human yet. In the Scripture, it's more likely you get to the human is ensouled when he takes his first breath. And so you could argue that it's not a human until that point. Everybody can draw their own lines. I like brains.
Sure.
And so Sagan said, as soon as you see human-like brainwave patterns, you got a human.
That's interesting. I that's interesting. I land probably somewhere else, and I approach it probably similarly. Like I am trying to reach a similar sort of like understanding. First, I understand the dilemma similarly, that we do have two different sides speaking about this in completely different languages.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a problem, because it's really going to be hard if what each side wants is just like the most extreme level of control about what the result should be, about what we're going to do about this issue. Then that's not a lot of room for negotiation. If it's just like it has to be the case. If on one side it is the argument that it has to be the case that we can terminate pregnancy as far as that means. If that means like in the labor process, then that would be pretty extreme. Same as I think an approach that said no termination under any circumstances. I don't care if your life is at stake. I don't care if the kid's life is at stake. That would be extreme as well. So I'm talking about this, trying to imagine, what a real honest balance is. And my whole thing is, I think what I always come back to is the place at which I understand what we're doing. What I find uncomfortable is that I don't like the scientific terminology that removes the humanity from it personally. I think brain or heart or electro whatever, shock or signal or whatever might all be relevant to the issue, but ultimately I think what we're doing is killing humans. And the question in my mind is this one of those occasions where we think it's okay to kill humans? I want to establish the question first, because I feel like we can't even do that because of the different languages we're speaking. Because on one side we're talking about killing humans, on the other side we're talking about terminating fetuses. And I understand that to some degree. I understand where that comes from if it's true that there's such a difference between a fetus and a human, but I don't think there is. I think that we actually are killing humans, and that we're like trying to, and I think the appropriate question is, do we think it's okay to kill humans or not?
Well, first thing I want to call your attention to is that we as a nation need to talk to each other like you and I are talking to each other. That's what we need the most.
Agreed.
My second observation, when Hillary Clinton got up when she was running for president and said abortion ought to be legal, safe, and rare,
Mm-hmm.
if the pro-life movement had said, all right, let's talk about rare, we'd have saved a ton of babies.
Yeah.
And my third observation, what I'm trying to build is, we need to make carrying these babies to term far more possible than it is. To even it needs to seem possible as well as be possible. And a lot of abortions happen because the mothers have hit the wall. She got pregnant right after her previous baby was born, which happens, and she's exhausted trying to get this baby up to speed so she can hope to give some attention to the next one. There are far too many women who don't have any resources. There's going through a pregnancy in, say, Texas, where the pregnancy mortality rate is very high. Yeah, it's small numbers, but they're huge if you're the numbers are way too high, higher than other countries and higher than some places that don't have nearly the resources we have.
Mm.
And it's largely because they don't have any medical care. And so we have to deal with the medical care and do something, one way or the other, to make sure that pregnant women, especially if you're going to prevent them from getting abortions, have access to medical care. It's a price you have to pay. There's no way around it. And other kinds of support. If you're an overwhelmed mother and you're pregnant, and you know that you can get in touch with somebody who can come over and help you, that could be transformative. So we have to do that. The statistics are overwhelming when an area that's run by Democrats, or when a conservative state gets a liberal administration for a while, the abortions go down. They go down because of high quality sex education, and they go down because they give access to condoms and remove some of the recriminations, and they don't teach abstinence only. While teaching abstinence is important, it's very important to tell young people that they can choose not to have sex. But that should be coupled with what to do. I read an article recently about teenagers in several red states who have taken the job on to teach each other sex education because they can't get it in the schools. And they've done a very adult job of putting together all the resources they could find so that they have books and pamphlets to pass out and contact numbers for people to talk to and all of that. That's part of the thing. It's a conservative trope that teaching kids about sex will make them more curious. In Denmark, they teach a very thorough sex education course to every kid that's growing up, and their onset of sexuality is much later in life. They're willing to wait. They understand. And so we've got to go to that. But in the end, let's have an honest discussion on how to reduce the demand for abortions.
Yeah.
Because I have a strong feeling, it's more than a strong feeling, I'm convinced the current climate, they put state by state abortion laws. Some of them are not as restrictive as others, but they put the abortion laws in, and I'm convinced they're completely unenforceable, because more people approve of access to abortion than do feel like the that the abortions should be banned as much as is practically possible. And so we saw this with prohibition when they banned alcohol. If a really large number of Americans are motivated to break the law, they will. And so they'll start driving out of state until they pass the law that you can't drive out of state, which is against the Constitution. You're as an American citizen, you're free to travel. They'll do something to restrict access to the abortion pills, and if they don't find a way around that, then organized crime will provide them. Look at the look at the war on drugs and see how easy it is to be successful. If people want to do something, they will find a way.
Right. Well, we could stay on this for a minute. I want to ask you about.
Wherever you want to go, I'm good.
Okay. I can reserve that, I think, for the next question. But so I relate, I think, to a perspective that's like, interested in how we make life better in a way that limits the need for uncomfortable. Because it sounds like that's what we're talking about on a more like an abstracted level. Is like, can we imagine creating a life that produces fewer of these problems? Like if abortion is a problem, then can we imagine a
You've
life
already
that
said
produces?
abortion is a problem, and it's fair to say that.
Yeah. So, but can we imagine one where we solve the problem, like we make a lifestyle secure enough that the problem that I put forward, which is to confront the possibility that let me phrase it this way. If I'm right that we're killing people, if it's true that we're killing people, and if it's true that given the circumstances that are unfortunate about life, that sometimes make that really, really understandable that somebody would choose that path, even though it might not be whatever the most obvious one for somebody to choose when they're pregnant or something. Like, that's not an easy choice for most people to make, is just like to say, fuck it, I'll just terminate my pregnancy. But say we create a lifestyle that like really reduces that a lot, but it still happens.
Mm-hmm.
We still have the same problem. It still have the question of, is this a moral issue, I guess, the issue of abortion or whatever. And that seems to be like what the Christians are saying, is like, doesn't matter the circumstances that necessarily bring it about. And when I'm saying, I'm using a really good friend of mine as like a vessel to access these arguments, because these aren't necessarily mine, but a friend of mine who like talks to me about this stuff, she's just adamant, like, the circumstances do not change the fact that an innocent life is being terminated that didn't do anything, didn't kill anybody, didn't do anything. So even if we imagine that society that produces a great lifestyle and all the proactive stuff to try to make it rare, what do we do with the fact that there's a moral question about the act in itself?
Well, there's a couple of ways. Let's take the word moral out of context for a minute.
Okay.
And think, you can decide whether things are right or wrong using whatever your conscience gives you. But you can decide the right and wrong of a thing. But doesn't morality expect more of you than that? And you're doing that. You're like, maybe we should not go pell-mell for free and open abortions everywhere in the country to anybody that wants one. Okay. And so you're wanting to restrict abortions, right? That's the ultimate goal.
That would be the ultimate goal of that's what I'm playing with, yes. Of course,
Okay.
like, that's not necessarily the position that I'm holding as a real person, but that's the angle we're talking
But
about.
this is what this is what you brought.
Yeah.
This was what you put on the table.
Yeah.
And so there are some people who believe that there's nothing wrong with getting an abortion under whichever parameters you want to define it by. There's more than one way to think about when you should put a stop to any abortions, or which abortions are permissible and for what reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But in the end, you've got a clash of two ways of looking at the world that are, as I said way earlier, they're not resolvable.
Yeah.
I mean, they're just not. And so in the end, it looks to me like the moral, ethical thing to do is stop as much killing as you can. And so the ethical thing to do is back to what I just said. Let's see how many abortions we can stop.
By making it rare.
And the upside of that is you make progress. You even make progress a little earlier on, and then when you get down to the end of when you've exhausted trying to make abortion rare, you have a smaller problem to tackle.
Fair, yeah.
And so if stopping abortion is your goal, and the government passed a law protecting abortion that lasted 50 years, and a whole bunch of the society believes that we should go back to doing that, and you want to save babies, and if you believe as I do that as long as people really want abortions, the laws that make restrictions functional are not enforceable. If you believe those things, why don't we shoot for rare and then see where we can get? You don't have to stop trying to stop all abortions to look for rare, but you're going to have to sit down at the table with some people you don't like very much.
Yeah.
And negotiate, which is really dirty if you're talking morality. Negotiating about morality is dirty business.
It really is. Yeah, you're not wrong. But those discussions, that is what would be necessary if we actually expect for these two parties to be somewhat heard and somewhat their position somewhat, respected in some way.
Yeah.
Because it is a little bit too total, I guess, on each side. If that's, what people were worried about is what it started to feel like. Now, I don't know. I didn't read everything that every state started to institute or play with or whatever, all the little changes.
Oh, there's so much noise you can't get there.
Yeah, exactly. Let me ask you this, man. So you're anyway, I'll just jump into the question. I have been sitting around this house for about, 5 years, fucking with my understanding of the identities of liberal and conservative, what they're for, what they are, how they exist, why we have them, and whether, and this is my ultimate question. I've been trying to figure out what it means to live without an ideology, to not be a liberal and to not be a conservative and to be this other thing, this thing that I don't know how to describe exactly what I understand it as, but most people I know, they feel generally more comfortable with either like a liberal identity or a conservative one. That's the problem I've been playing with. I give that to you. You can say whatever you want in response.
That's an interesting question. Okay. Let's start here. Conservatives in America used to have a very, very different ideology than they have now. Conservatives, when we did the voting rights laws and other equal rights laws in the 1960s, the Democratic Party put it on the floor, but it took some really remarkable men on the Republican side to negotiate the rest of the votes to bring it home. The Republicans saved that bill, and they were conservatives. You can have your issues with the Republicans now, but that's something you should remember as you're working through this. They morph. they've called themselves conservatives straight along, but their philosophy now, at least in terms of their actions, is very different than when I was young. And one of the things that happened, I don't know if you remember well when George Bush Sr. was running for president.
No.
Okay. One of his political things that he inserted into his speeches, he called it the L word to talk about liberals. And he referred to it as a dirty thing. And they started picking up some early then even through his son's presidency, they had never really, in my view, gone off the rails, but liberals became more and more associated with evil than, as far as conservatives were concerned, than they had been in the past. And Democrats, the Democratic Party through the 50s was where you got the Ku Klux Klan. And it was where you got a lot of the subversive white supremacy, voter suppression, everything else. That was a Democratic thing, not a Republican thing. And somehow, as the Voting Rights Act of, 65, 67, as that thing became law, somehow those Democrats, because the Democrats had brought up that bill, they were so pissed that they abandoned the party and went to the Republican Party, and they almost just completely switched sides. And so you had Strom Thurmond, the segregationist in South Carolina, and Jesse Helms in North Carolina, fighting to do as little damage as possible, trying to let the black people become equal.
Mm-hmm.
Now the Republican Party was still full of great men of good minds, and you know those people that voted the Civil Rights Act into place were still there, but things were changing.
Let me jump in and ask a question. Things were changing. So maybe you can help me break this down, because I don't know. Tell me if you know about this. I hope you know. I hope you might. When I hear Democrat, I hear democracy in there. When I hear Republican, I hear Republican there. And I know what those words mean. The question might be, what does membership to those parties have to do with those systems of organization or whatever? What does being a Republican have to do with the word republic? And then to me, well, I mean, like now it seems that conservatives are Republicans and liberals are Democrats, and like those, it's very just like that's how it works out. So like I know what that looks like now, but like whatever it means to be in the Republican Party, was that not at war with a liberal identity like it is now?
Okay. When the Republican Party started using the word conservative, it was based on conserving. Their argument was we inherited a great nation, and we should conserve what made it great. And for the most part, they were interested in doing that. But politics is a funny animal. And so a lot of times politics is playing a game with you back my bill and I'll back yours that have nothing to do with philosophy. But the liberals thought we should use our intellect to take advantage of our ability to make the changes in the way the country works, based on what we learn over time as we work our way through history to now. And so they were, as science became a practice with serious teeth in it, they were more interested in using what the scientists learned and all of that. And they were very willing to change the way we had done, the way we had governed ourselves, if they thought they had a better idea. Well, that should leave us in a great place, because you get people who gung-ho want to do stuff being reminded that we did these other things for good reason, and don't throw them away thoughtlessly, And so the two parties together was what made it great. And I don't know how. It still kind of makes sense to call the Democrats liberals and the Republicans conservatives, but it makes a lot less sense than it used to. But the Democrats are still on the money for trying to help the bottom end of the society lead good lives. This is a liberalism that goes back to Franklin Roosevelt, not to the beginning of time. But when Franklin Roosevelt put out the New Deal and gave us Social Security and Medicare, and we didn't have Medicare yet, but had done, we did have a little bit of Medicare. It wasn't nearly as much as it is now. But he put those in a 40-hour work week and helped bolster up the formation of unions, and that he was putting the common man in a position to have a good fighting chance. And during that time, the Republicans were screaming and hollering about socialism, like that necessarily has to be a dirty word, and trying to stop him from doing that, because it was a radical departure from the way we had been governing up to then. They were trying to preserve the Union as it had been governed since the Declaration was signed. There is nothing. There's nothing inherently wrong with that philosophy as it's been stated so far. But one of the things the conservatives of that time were supporting was, you take the smartest, most accomplished people in the country and you give them tremendous responsibility to help run it. So they were for the very rich. The very rich were a different class of men back then than they are now, but that was the whole idea. That same conservatism applied to the plantation owners in the South that had slaves. It's not always good, but they thought that was the best way to go forward, and Roosevelt felt like the guys that sweat for their living, they are also great sources of how the country ought to be run. And so he was trying to bolster them up. And so labor unions made an amazing difference in the lives of working men. And minimum wage, which Roosevelt described as enough money to live a decent life, put a roof over your head, and feed your kids properly. And so minimum wage was never about making sure that teenagers could have jobs. It was much more than that. And when he put, when Roosevelt put the New Deal into place, and then Eisenhower came behind him, the conservative Mr. Eisenhower supported the New Deal and kept it going. And through the 50s and on up through most of the 60s, we had the fastest growing, most potent middle class any country had ever seen. Because wealth doesn't trickle down, it trickles up. So if you make sure that these people down here have spending money, they will spend it. They will not sequester it away. And so the money circulates in the economy, and people buy stuff, a decent percentage of that from local people. And when you buy a McDonald's hamburger, some of that money goes to the employees of McDonald's, and so they spend it, and the money circulates a little while. And in the end, the rich people have to work for their dollars if they're going to get it out of that society. They have to do something useful with it. But now they've worked the situation so that they have very rich people pay far less money percentage-wise in taxes, and they have loopholes, and they get away with a lot of not being helpful to our economy. They do a lot of great stuff too, but the Democrats want to balance that out again. I've gone way off I don't know. Did I even come close to answering your question?
We definitely dealt with things around the question. Yeah, there's just a lot there, so we'll unpack some more of it. So, yeah. Oh shoot, yeah. There's tons to play with. The one thing I was going to mention. So I think what I experience a lot of the time. Originally, my question was about sort of what it means to be liberal, what it means to be conservative, and I think that's what you were kind of getting to, was going through the history of what led to these identities and why we have them and what they have been over the course of maybe like the last 50 or 75 years, something like that. So then some of that is about some of that consists of a little bit of maybe a value differentiation between what at different points, whether it was like a better idea to approach things with a conservative or with a liberal sort of agenda in mind, and at what point they were trying to sort of tackle society to create a certain outcome. And some of that story sounds like, in these occasions, these were liberal decisions that were made that had positive outcomes. But then, of course, as you already mentioned just now, like there's positive outcomes due to conservatives, due to Republicans and shit that exist as well. Like without, like the New Deal and like minimum wage and shit like that. These are examples of things that were put in place to not let labor be the only thing a person ever did, or like to not have to work a 24-hour day in order to still not make enough money to live and shit like that. But of course, like, it's worth mentioning that having a boss, having an employer is like part of that too. Like, it's important to have a job. It's important to be a part of the economy. And that is not exclusively a conservative or Republican role to play to be an employer. But, that's something that I think, at least what I hear from your average like modern day liberal, they talk about entitlements for employers, they talk about entitlements for the employed a lot, and that's the other side of that's the economic side of what we're talking about with abortion. Like that's the language that they speak, is a language of what are employees entitled to. And then a language that's on the other side of that is like, how free can employers be, you know? And that is like a Republican identity and a liberal identity. And my approach in that instance as well, with abortion, with voting, with everything, is I see these identities, I see the languages they speak. I want to understand both languages and see what there is that's good in both languages, and also see what is bad about both languages. And I want to kind of reserve judgment and always be playing for the team that I think needs to be played for. Which brings me back to the original question of why is it a good idea to be liberal? Is it a good idea to be conservative? If we stand if we run the risk of being so partisan that we are blind to, say, the good that Republicans do, or we're blind to the good that Democrats do. Would it be better to try to stay neutral as far as identities go, or is that inevitable? Do you think?
The Republican and Democratic parties are both divided by the same religion, which is an interesting thing to think about. Right now, mainline religions, the old, we did it this way all these years, I don't see a reason to change now. Those are the liberal religions. And the Republicans have picked up more the more reactionary religions. I hate to say that, but that's what it is. But in the end...
How do you mean?
Well, evangelical is a huge word that goes all over everywhere, and not all evangelicals are the same as the evangelical congregations that just went all in for Trump, for instance. But they're practitioners of the same religion that mainline Episcopalians are practicing, but the two sides couldn't agree less.
Right.
And so I think both sides are trying to argue from a position of morality, but they understand morality very differently. Mm-hmm. I'm going to say a couple of things. First is, because the words liberal and conservative no longer mean what they traditionally meant, we really don't know what the definition of either one of them is.
Interesting, yeah.
And so we basically throw those words out as shorthand because it gets rid of a lot. It's not accurate, but it gets rid of a lot of the confusion when you're trying to talk to somebody. But that having been said, so the Democrats started trying to use the term progressive, but progressive also has a meaning, and a lot of the left isn't. A lot of liberalism isn't all that progressive, and the progressives are really all in for making sure everybody's got a minimum lifestyle, and they're willing to look at whatever comes along. But a lot of those that would describe themselves as liberals or Democrats, they're really uncomfortable with going that far out of our historical norms.
Yeah.
And so they don't all agree on anything. But the progressives can put forth new ideas that the moderates in the Democratic Party can live with, and then, but also they put forth a lot of stuff that they just can't. Joe Manchin is a Democrat. He's been a Democrat for a long time, but he's been a real bone of contention for the party lately. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I have heard his name, and I remember listening to some
The
stories
Senate,
about
the
what was
Senate
going
is
on.
50-50. The vice president votes when when a tied Senate um, votes. If all the Republicans vote one way and all the Democrats vote the other, it's a tie until the vice president casts a vote.
Mm.
But Joe Manchin has fought against a lot of the bills the Democrats have tried to put through, and so he's become a bit of a boogeyman for the Democrats. But he's a
Yeah.
Democrat. He is really a Democrat, but he's very moderate. He's very cautious with the money. I'm not a huge fan of Joe Manchin, but I see who he is, and he's not my enemy.
I mean, man, part of the reason that this all happened was prior to, when I say this all happened, I mean this experiment that I've been doing with ideology. It's because these shifts that the liberals have kind of experimented with, and basically progressivism. I can't stand progressivism. I can't stand the romancing of. I personally can't stand the romancing of like socialism and stuff like that. And I think people are a little unhinged on the left side of the spectrum, which is not what I was used to. Like when I first kind of stopped identifying with conservatives, I found liberalism really alluring because it all seemed really sensible. But in this current climate, I find it harder and harder to relate to the most vocal, like wild side of the progressive stuff. And so I can't, like, when you give me that description of Joe Manchin, I'm like, oh, that reminds me of myself a little bit because I can't fuck with this either, really.
Well, it's another. I don't want to talk about Joe Manchin right now. I want to talk about socialism.
Sure.
Can I turn the tables on you and ask you why you're so concerned about socialism?
Well,
What is socialism?
part of it for me, well, we could start either place. So,
Take your pick.
part of it for me, my relationship with socialism that will hopefully get to the answer of what it is, or at least how I define it. Part of it does come with bias because my grandmother's from Cuba, and so she's always been kind of warning me about communism and like what it is and what it entails and what her experience under communism was like. And I've taken that pretty seriously. That used to be kind of a family joke, like, oh, everything is just socialism and communism and stuff. But more and more, it seemed more and more over the last couple years, I've seen that actually people are running with this, and like it's not a joke. Like people are identifying with it and taking it on as an identity. So I'm like, well, that's fascinating, and if that's true, then I'm gonna distance myself from it really hardcore. A couple years back, I don't think I was scared of that term. I think I thought socialism was like an interesting idea in the same way I think a lot of people do now. I think a lot of people think of it as just the attitude that those who have less, we could come up with a society that considers those who have less and tries to compensate for that through social programs. I think that's what most people think that they're signing up for. What I actually think socialism is an economic system that sort of puts sort of according to, based on Marx, best we know of, supposed to be an economic system that puts that deals with the problem that people who own capital benefit more from owning their capital than they do from like working for somebody else who owns capital. And so it deals with the problem that employees make less than people who own businesses, is what it's supposed to do, apparently. And also compensate for, also do what the New Deal did, like create a lifestyle that didn't make labor all that somebody was worth, because for a long time that was all somebody was worth. So I think Marx observed some things about society that it makes sense for us to resent, but some of those things are not escapable. You know, like I'm not sure that a life where you don't have to. I'm not sure that we don't want to have a laborious life. I'm not there. I don't want to get too like deeply philosophical about my thing here, but I'm not sure that Marx's sort of like economic answer to certain problems that he observed are a great idea. And I'm not sure that I'm not sure that all those problems can be dealt with from an economic lens. So anyway, socialism was that. Socialism is not socialism, as far as I'm concerned, is just like some kind of middle ground between somebody who has a communist identity and somebody who just wants to be nice. It's just like it's just kind of this means to an end, and that end, I believe is a state-controlled economy that totally fucks up everything. I think communism is fucked.
I want to start with this.
Did I make sense to you, by the way?
Yes, you did.
Okay.
You mentioned Castro. I'm going to throw out Mao Zedong and Stalin.
Okay.
And maybe Hugo Chavez and you name them. You know who I'm talking about, what kind of people.
Mm-hmm.
Dictatorships. That's what they were.
Yeah.
I think Castro probably intended to create a socialist society, but it didn't take him long to just take over and become a dictator. And then Marx got thrown out of the window. Everything got thrown out of the window. And he tried to logic his way through how to build his island's economy. And he wasn't particularly good at it, but he had the power in the military.
Yeah.
And who knows how many people Stalin had to kill to put his to take control of his country. And he wasn't using economic principles. He was using brute force.
Mm-hmm.
Mao Zedong did a better job, and China got off to a better start for becoming more socialist, and it was transformative for the lower classes, but it just wasn't for whatever reason it wasn't sustained. But these are dictatorships; they're not socialism, and socialism and democracy are not exclusive. You can have both. A democracy can have programs that make people's lives better. There's a good intentions motivation for a lot of people to forget that we're limited in what we can do, but we can do a lot. And so when the New Deal got put in place, and Eisenhower took the presidency, had a war to pay for, the base rate for taxation for the very wealthy was 93%.
Mm-hmm.
They made money. They made lots of money. It wasn't until Kennedy took office that he gave them a break on taxes and took it down to 70%. And they still made money.
Yeah.
The reason was because the money started circulating in the economy. People can buy stuff. That analogy doesn't perfectly hold up now because we were still an industrial society back then. And so if you wanted to make more money, you made another factory, which provided tons of jobs. And so that's how the middle class got so big. It would be hard to replicate that now, but it remains that the U.S.'s economy would benefit from more pressure to make small business work.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can afford to pay a little extra to buy your neighbor's homemade belt, enough people will do that it'll work. And if he gets popular because he makes really good belts, he hires a couple of people, he makes more good belts. Maybe it becomes a small factory for making really good belts, but it expands the income rate for everybody. And that is how you get to a healthy economy. And now, Elon Musk doesn't sell very many, doesn't sell enough Teslas to make that much of a dent in the auto market. Shoot, he can't get the materials to do it. There's issues with supply lines and stuff, and we can't mine enough lithium to get the batteries all done. And we're having here we are with China's got what they're calling the worst drought and heat wave the world has ever seen. It covers a huge swath of area. The temperatures have been running average 114 degrees and no rain, and it's a major part of it is over one of their best agricultural zones. And at the same time, we're having a lesser drought in the Southwest. And so the mining in China's locking down and not being able to produce enough power, no water, no power, all of that. And all of that, China has it because it's the nature of their entire economy. But in the United States, we should have had, for a long time, a bunch of little companies that make chips, and instead what we get is this company learns how to make chips efficiently, and so somebody that has a use for the chips just buys the company, and now they're part of some big conglomerate instead of growing the chip industry in the United States organically like it should be. What is it? 5 people produce 80% of the food that we eat? Or 5 companies? Monsanto and Bayer and, boy, are we in for a reckoning over that.
Yeah.
It's like endgame, call it capitalism, call it socialism, whichever one you want. But not controlling the economy has been a very bad mistake.
Well, so there's obviously a lot to work with there. So it sounds like what you're describing to me is these really big global issues that deal with global economies, and how there on the other side of that, like on the human level, day to day, that we have this option to sort of support individuals within the economy at a greater expense or whatever, but support individuals rather than like these. Are you talking about like massive corporations? Like, is that what you're talking about as a part of what, like capitalism and the opposite of socialism or something?
Okay. So Amazon has enormous control over the sales of goods now. Mm-hmm. Walmart is the nation's greatest employer. It's the world's greatest employer. If Walmart doesn't pay their people much, then nobody pays people much, because and Walmart makes an enormous amount of money, and they've finally come around to starting to bring the wages up to $15 an hour, but it's years late to do that because inflation didn't stop. And so when everybody was screaming for $15, that's not enough anymore. We're talking about the minimum wage, according to Franklin Roosevelt, was enough to put the roof over your head and the feed your kids. I think he said 2 adults and 2 kids was his idea of a family. And so if you worked for minimum wage at a shoe store at a mall, you should come out. If you work for 40 hours, you should be able to have a modest place to live and a couple of bedrooms and to eat a healthy, full diet.
Right.
You know, you don't get anything fancy for that. Nobody ever promised you minimum wage would get you to a fancy restaurant or whatever, but you could survive.
Mm-hmm.
And you could raise your kids, and they grow up healthy because they ate well. And Walmart's made great strides, but they're still short. And if Walmart doesn't pay people, who is? Same thing with Amazon. Well, we just got what we wanted, unionization. They're starting to unionize the Amazon jobs. It'll take a few years, but after a while, they're going to demand to make a decent living. Especially Amazon, they work people like robots.
So that's just a small observation that I made that I'll throw in is like when you were talking about Mao, you seem to feel as though his approach to socialism was somehow better than maybe other examples.
He started out better.
I mean, I guess you would also acknowledge that Mao like murdered tons of people.
Mao put in a lot of programs in the early years of his reign in China
Mm-hmm.
that really did make huge strides in giving his people a better living than they'd ever had.
Right.
That wasn't hard. They had dismal conditions in China, but he really did do that.
Yeah.
And then the machinery of government, with Mao's blessing, the machinery of government started in on making China strong, and the corruption that goes with that just sort of ruined it all. So now we're seeing the is it a prime minister or President Xi in China? It's becoming more and more oppressive there. And their biggest city, Shanghai, the people in Shanghai, the average income is more like $25,000 than $50,000. Half what we make here in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not growing the economy for the little people, which is stifling its country, which is having a lot of financial trouble now.
So there might be little things peppered in there about China that maybe you and I see differently that might not be all
You're
that
welcome
important.
to disagree with
Yeah.
me.
It might not be. No, I know, but it might not be that important to even
You do
figure
not need
out.
to apologize for disagreeing with me.
I'm not. But well, I mean,
don't get mad.
what came to mind was we're talking about workers, and Mao had an interesting approach to equalization.
Yeah,
and
did.
like made people dress the same and made people
he did that.
all that weird shit. So when you were talking about the Amazon people, I was just kind of thinking, well, Amazon's a great example of tons of horror stories where under sort of no holds barred capitalism, people can be treated like fucking cattle and just whatever. But I think Mao might be one of those examples, just one of those examples where socialism didn't necessarily free people from that problem altogether. So I guess the question might be, clearly you have the value in there that you care about the workers, and I do too, or whatever. But is your take that like socialism is, as far as you can tell, the most superior answer to some of the problems that like the lower and middle class face?
I think that the best economy you can create uses the best ideas of all the systems.
Yeah.
And I want it to be, if you could get an economy that puts its low-rung citizens on some kind of reasonable financial footing, and if you provide the education and a little hand up, you start having to do less of that because they can make their own way in the world. And that's your goal, is not to just take on all the poor people and give them free money. I'll tell you, there's a good example. So last presidential election, there was a guy in the on the Democratic side who was proposing a guaranteed income to Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Wanted to give everybody $1,000 a month. Okay, that is an idea that I threw out the window almost immediately. But I started looking up some stuff, and it turned out that I think it was Alberta. They picked a medium-sized town in Alberta to try it out. It was a town that wasn't in terrible shape, but there was more unemployment than was average in Canada. And they started giving everybody, I think it was $2,000 a month. And they did that. First year, it didn't make much of a change, except everybody got better food and the restaurant picked up.
Mm-hmm.
But by the end of the second year, an overwhelming percentage of them had gone out and gotten jobs. And they had started on the road to financial independence from the, and eventually, the way that worked, if you went out and got a job, it didn't shut down your government contribution, but after a certain point, the government contribution started to go down, but not as fast as your wages went up. And so if you got a job, you made more money until there wasn't any more to be made. It worked, and it worked really well, and it's been tried a couple of other times. I have that one to offer you. I have several cities in the United States have tried this. You build a building with little units that are a living room with a kitchenette area and a shower. And it's for homeless people. And you don't charge anything for them to live there. Getting a job does not immediately get you kicked out. They provide you with a suit or two for going to interviews. And it takes a little while for them to get cleaned up and start feeling like human beings after they've been living on the street. But if you walk outside in a decent set of clothes, you get treated differently by everybody. And it works just dandy. It is a cheaper way to deal with homeless people in your town than trying to keep them off the streets. Give them a place to go. These are very modest places, and they don't humiliate them. They don't drug test them, but they make sure that they have access to counseling, and there's some level of being there is some enforcement of drug laws and too much alcohol, but it's not intrusive because we're trying to give them their dignity back.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a thought, but it works, and it's socialism.
So what is your definition of socialism?
Um, you put the workers more in charge of the way factories are run. Um, actually, the New Deal was socialist. I'll give them that. It was exactly socialist. It was a socialist program in a capitalist economic system. Nothing wrong with calling it socialist, but it wasn't anything like they've ever had in the Soviet Union or in Mao's China or Hugo Chavez's Venezuela, I guess it was. Is that right?
I think so.
Hugo Chavez had it knocked. He had a huge amount of oil. They could bring in money that didn't cost his populace anything. Then they could visit upon it every kind of corruption you can think of and still give him a little bit pocket money. You know, it was pretty easy for him to be Hugo Chavez, but that's not always so easy. Alaska, they give everybody an income off the oil reserves that are being pumped out of Alaska. Everybody gets a nice check every month. That's socialism, but it's socialism within a capitalist overlay, and it's the smart thing to do. But I think you try to make pure capitalism out of what we've got. It isn't really pure capitalism, or call it endgame capitalism if you want. But it's all decked out to most of the money ends up not being competed for in our system. It's an oligarchy, if you want to call it that. Very rich people hold all the money, and you don't know who they are. You know Elon Musk, but most of them you don't know who they are at all.
Yeah.
And they're military contractors and whatever else. And that started when they were building the railroads. You know, those guys got incredibly wealthy on government money.
Okay. So the reimagining of the hierarchy, I think, is what I'm most familiar with from like people who seem to identify with socialism. And yeah, the old Marx thing was like factory workers seizing the means of production. But maybe a question is like, to what end does that go? Are we specifically talking about factories, or are we talking about like all businesses? Like, are we talking about bars? Are we talking about movie theaters? You know, like, are we talking about the hypothetical society where if somebody opens a bar, then their employees should be, like, morally should be in charge of it?
I wouldn't think so. And I think that we could lay down the parameters as grown-ups before we start, and we can set benchmarks for what we expect to see, so that if we don't see it, we can make corrections. And we can't do that right now. We can't even talk to each other.
Yeah.
But and workers control the means of production doesn't mean that they take over the factories exactly. But it does mean that they get to figure out how all this gets done, or get their piece of that, which is smart because they know how to do it. You know. And I don't know. I guess I mostly think of socialism and communism. Communism works great in small numbers with a small population. Doesn't work very well after that. But as far as I can tell, communism has never been tried on a large scale. No country has ever been communist. Not by any definition you would have of communism.
Yeah, maybe. Like, so people would try to offer China as an example, which obviously is their economy is not communist, and that's for sure. At least I mean, they basically implement the reason. From what I understand, the way that China became a superpower was by implementing basically a capitalistic economy approach to production that made them blow the fuck up.
Yeah, they sort of lied to everybody. They decided to make a capitalist. No, capital's the wrong word. They tried to create an overlay over their economy that was uncommunist.
Mm-hmm.
And China wasn't really communist to begin with. But
before we do that, what do you mean? I've heard that phrase before, that communism hasn't been tried or whatever, and I might not agree, but I don't know yet. What does it mean? Like, when we have a country like Cuba that's described as communist, what does it mean to say they're not, or that, like, the Soviet Union wasn't communist?
In a communist system, everybody has a say in how everything is run. And so I'm arguing that you can have a communist neighborhood association. That's not really that hard. And everybody kind of comes to agreements on how stuff happens in your neighborhood. But on the grand scale, I don't really... They always end up being dictatorships. I can't think of an example to give you to help explain it, and trying to verbalize a government's kind of complicated.
I think the reason I disagree is because I think it's one thing to describe communism as like a system through which people come to agreements by all having an equal voice, but that is also exactly how you would describe what democracy is. And, that's like, if we try to, is this a democracy?
It's how we how we get around to understanding what people want and
sure
make agreements about how okay.
Yeah, there's like more stuff in there too. Like,
sure,
communism, it consists of more than that too. Otherwise, I guess we would be talking about a democracy. So, like, it consists of more shit. And like we were talking about, it consists of things like the assumption that it's a worthwhile effort to make sure that workers they have an equal skin in the game as people who say own capital. Like, that's a pretty important part of it. So I don't know. I think that, like, on some scale, communism in some form has definitely been tried. Maybe it hasn't been like perfect democracy, but I think, like, societies based in those principles, I think has been tried.
In the end, how much real difference is there between the czars that ruled Russia and before, and Lenin who ruled it after, or Stalin? How much difference is there really?
Yeah, I guess some people would say under Stalin there was quite a difference. Of course, I don't know what the czars were like, but, like, I mean,
okay.
The shit that happened under Stalin probably was pretty noticeably different, I guess.
Oh, it was.
Yeah.
It was, but the government structure.
Yeah. None.
The underlying governmental structure
Yeah.
is pretty much, in the end, a king is a dictator. In the end, the head of the communist government is a dictator. In the end, we have in democracy the ability to place restraints on our leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And we still have that. It still exists, and we can make our nation better. But nobody could tell Stalin what to do.
Exactly.
And so I don't really see any evidence of why we would want to call the government of Russia any other thing than a dictatorship. Um, Putin has set up. They started making inroads into moving out of that, but when Putin took over, he killed it all. And so the people of Russia can't vote Putin out of office.
Right.
And so they have no say in how the government is run. And Putin has control of all of the media, or very much most of the media. And so he can tell them whatever he wants them to hear, and they don't have anything else to believe. So here we are. And we're having a war with Ukraine, and Putin has more support in Russia than we can understand because they have no idea what's going on.
Yeah.
Putin's losing ground with the people figuring out how to get other information, and with people coming back from the war and being able to spread the news from living room to living room and all of that. But that's going to take an awfully long time. And so there he is. And so I hear the word communist, and I just think, there's another guy that doesn't know what he's talking about, you know?
Yeah, I've really shifted gears on that. This is where we're at. And a friend of mine, well, like what we were talking about earlier.
Do you have friends?
Sort of.
Oh, cool.
When I told another one of my friends about this friend, he was like, "Why are you friends with this guy?" But I've known this guy a long time. We were real close, but so this is what I'm talking about the identity of the communist, because it's like I'm trying to really emphasize this. I don't believe that these things are real. I don't believe that these philosophies are real. I think that these are I think these identities are kind of like costumes we wear and things that we adopt. And again, my big project is trying to figure out if we actually need them, if we need these like identities that are based in these beliefs. And my friend comes at me talking about, like, I was talking about some shit that was going on in Cuba, and my friend kind of tells me that it's capitalist propaganda, which I thought was a joke. But we start talking, and I realize he legitimately is like, communism is the way to go, man. Like, it's what we have to do to find utopia and all this shit. And I'm like, is this a joke, or you actually have subscribed to this? And he's actually subscribed to it, to the point where I was like, okay, let me give you a situation here. Let's say I buy this house. I live here. Let's say I have a farm and food, and I have my instruments, and I just have my little life. You're saying you're dreaming of a system where personal property isn't a thing. Would you be in favor of a system that said that I had to give up this property, like the ownership of it, at the threat of force, at the threat of prison, at the threat of death? And he said, yes, that's what I would suppose would be the best. And I said, okay, I don't voluntarily want that. I would tell you straight out, that's not the system I want. What would you like to do? Implement that system by force against the will of me, despite the fact that I don't subscribe to the idea that property can't be owned. And he said, yeah, we would just have to do it through force, and that's like the lifestyle we would impose on everyone. That's a real attitude of a person my age living amongst us. I'm not happy about that.
Has he lived in Cuba?
No.
Okay. You're right. I never even addressed that part of communism. Everybody owns everything. I don't understand how it could work. You can do it, once again, you can do it in small groups, but people will, if you try to get everybody to be equal, some people will rise above the rest of them, and they will take over, and they'll do it every time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and somebody will climb the hierarchy, and eventually you won't have communism anymore. It's human nature. There's an alpha male, and then there's, you know, an alpha male over a couple of wolf packs, and then it just gets, and eventually you've got John Galt at the top of the hill.
John Galt, that's his name. I was telling somebody that I think Elon Musk might be John Galt. He was just going to vanish into a mountain one day. But, yeah, I mean, you were talking about dictatorships, and you were talking about, like, you know, these examples, these structures, they all had dictators in them. And that's true, and that does seem counter to communism. But I think it's inevitable with structures. And the part that makes it inevitable with communism, I think, is the bit that my friend supposed, that, like, this kind of society could be imposed against the will of the people, against the will of the majority. If you're going to go against the will of the majority, you're going to have a dictator to do it, probably.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, here lately in the United States, we've been governed in many ways against the will of the people.
Mm.
Gerrymandering is a way to govern against the will of the people. When you create an abortion law, like we talked about earlier, when you create one of those, even though the absence of abortion law is what the people want, you may not like that, but that's what it is. Actually preserving the right to an abortion is very popular.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're electing people we don't choose. We're doing a lot of stuff like that. We're not honoring the promise that the Constitution gave us. We need to get back to the Constitution. It's a pretty damn good document. But I was sort of, when they say communism and socialism, those are just words.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with Republican and Democrat. They end up being just words. And liberal and conservative. When you can watch one party change the definition of the politics of the other party just by messaging the other party doesn't have, it's just a word.
Yeah. They are just words. That's what fucks me up, man, because, like, people believe that it's their identity. And it is, honestly, it's just, I think it's half of your identity, everybody. You know, I think I'm half liberal in a major way. What I mean by that is I have in me the potential to agree with everything a liberal philosophy would tell me. And I have the potential in me to agree with everything a conservative philosophy would tell me. And my nurturing and my experiences and my biases and all this stuff inform what I tell you I think is true, which you have no idea if I even feel as though what I say is true. And a lot of time I don't either. Like,
yeah, no doubt.
Who the fuck knows what we actually think?
Welcome to being an American. I mean, that's everybody's like that.
I think that's,
you're not unique.
I know. I think that's humanity. It's not,
Yeah.
It's psychology. It's just, it's what it means to be a person. You can only discover so much of the truth and be able to actually accurately depict it and explain it to somebody else. And so I understand why we do these things, but, like, I think that we make a mistake thinking that these words, these, like, symbols for philosophies are actually our real identity. And I think that we miss a lot of our sort of, like, logical potential by, like, excluding whatever doesn't fit in that identity, personally. At least that's my experience with it.
I have a belief that the United States of America ought to stand down its entire nuclear arsenal, every last one of them, unilaterally, without any cooperation from any other country. just stand the whole thing down. If you want, I can explain you why I think that'll work. But in the end, I do honestly believe that.
Yeah.
No Democrat is talking about it. No Republican is talking about it. It neither fits the current liberal or conservative mindset, and it has never been in the mindset since we created nuclear weapons to begin with.
Yeah.
And I believe, I don't know, right now, I'm going to vote for Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
I believe the Republican Party needs a spanking, and they need to come back without all of the lip service and try to work with us again. But in my past, have always routinely chosen Republicans, more Democrats than Republicans, but give me a guy that speaks to me intelligently and will stand up for his own ideas, and I'll tolerate some ideas that I'm not in love with because I figure I understand who he is.
Yeah.
I'm nobody's pure partisan, but I think that the United States can't get moved to the next square from where it is unless we heal the impoverished class of Americans. And we're going to have to make some sacrifices to do that. And we're going to have to get clear of far more of our debt than we've already done, because global warming is going to be incredibly expensive. And so, I don't know. I mean, you look at the things out there, and I hate that we can't just do something about global warming, but right now, there's a party that has a mindset that will not step on the feet of people who wish to pollute without regulation. And so, and yes, carbon dioxide is a pollutant. Methane is a pollutant. As are all kinds of chemicals that are showing up now that the water's low. You know.
Mm. So there's a lot. I'd like to get, before we think about wrapping up, I want to get way more personal. I'm
a male.
You're a male. You're a guitar player. You have had all these experiences in life. Where are you from originally?
I'm officially a geezer.
A geezer.
I was born in Washington State. My dad was in the military, but we moved back to Atlanta. I might have been two. I don't remember Washington State at all. But my extended family on both sides is Atlanta. And my dad moved up here for a job. That's how I got here. I would not live anyplace else. I love this area.
Really?
Yeah. This is and my life has been magical. I live in my favorite house that I know about with my favorite woman that I know about. I worked hard for 40 years. My house is paid for. My cars are paid for. And my 403B made more money than I ever could have dreamed. And so I'm going to be able to afford my life going forward. So now I'm retired, and I don't have to do anything. Be jealous.
So, but yeah, you get to do some things. You're gardening. You have all sorts of little projects you do, right? Like, are you fucking around with instruments and shit these days?
Not lately, but I'm feeling the urge to get myself back up off my ass. But I needed time, and I don't regret that I just haven't been doing anything.
Yeah. Yeah, I respect that. What you just said kind of about your life was one of the main things I wanted to ask you about. Like, as I had no idea we were actually going to talk about politics. That was the last thing I figured we'd talk about. But what I would like to ask you about is life, like living life. Like, I think it's happiness. I think you strike me as somebody who, like a few people I've known in life, can sometimes, I get the impression just from a totally, I'm not in your head. I don't know what it's like to be you, but you strike me as somebody who chooses
There's
happiness.
nothing in my head.
You strike me as somebody that chooses happiness and like smiling and like being pleasant to be around and shit. And not everybody does. And I wonder if that rings true for you.
What you see of me, I am always like this. I got robbed of a decent emotional life. I don't have ups and downs. I don't have I don't really have sad times. I think I had to learn intellectually to have empathy for other people because I wasn't born with it. But yes, I am as happy as I seem to be, and I'm that way all the time.
And you just are.
Yeah.
It's not. Does that mean it's not a choice? Like, is that just your nature?
Why would I choose otherwise?
That's a good question.
Yeah. I think I learned from examples I had in life to my mother. You'd be driving down the road. My mother would be driving the car down the road. Somebody tried to cut her off, or somebody cut her off. And instead of getting mad, she would sit there and say, he may be trying to get his wife to the hospital so they can have a baby. Or she'd make an excuse for him so that she could forgive him, because she had a hot temper and she just fought with it all her life. But she would always come up with a narrative when something bad happened to make it not be so bad. And I think I learned that really well. And so, if you're driving down the road and somebody cuts you off, the truth is, if you drive enough, you're going to cut somebody else off. I mean, it's going to happen. Yeah, somebody rips you off, and you have to forgive them. Forgiveness is a really healthy thing to do. Don't forgive them, it hurts you. But looking at the upside of things doesn't take as much practice as it might seem like to some people. And looking at the dark side of things, I guess that's easy up front, but it's expensive to your whole everything. I mean,
Yeah.
if you do that, you won't live as long. I mean, it's really bad to not get over stuff and not forgive people.
We could take this right back to where we started, I
Yep,
think.
we sure could. I was just thinking that.
Nihilism is what comes to mind. A lot of people, especially like younger atheists too. I don't know if you ever used that term for yourself, but I did. And I actually don't now, though I could, because I'm effectively atheistic. But, a lot of people, if they don't have religion and stuff to look to, that produces a totally different thing than what you're describing, like a fucking pointless nihilism that tells them that their happiness is pointless. But that doesn't seem to be like what you're operating with.
I am an atheist.
Yeah.
I'm absolutely an atheist. And because there's controversy over it, it means that I believe there is no God. I don't just not believe in God, but I believe he does not exist. And the rest of that, because of the rest of the conversation we had, I can't prove that God doesn't exist any more than you can prove he does.
Right.
So my conclusion about the nature of the world is no better than yours. and that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter which one you have unless it can be disproven. Okay, so so I can like my Christian brethren just fine, no problem. uh, and and I don't know. Maybe it's helpful to if you haven't ever taken the time to figure out what the world around you is, I highly recommend you do that. Um, the search for God, once you get the lay of the land on how the economy works, you'll be cynical than you were before, probably, or maybe, but you can operate it better, you know? And spending actual energy learning stuff about how the world works is useful time, really useful time. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that ties into the next question I had for you. Like, you're sounds like you're starting to touch on things that give meaning to life or something like that, and things that even if some of them are uncomfortable or maybe make you cynical or frustrated, there's still good that can be done and utilized through all that. And I think, yeah, so the question that came to mind as you were walking through some of that is like, for a lot of people, yeah, like choosing happiness isn't necessarily an option, or like they feel like that maybe there's this relationship they have with their own emotions that's like they don't have the option to choose the more uplifting or optimistic or whatever side of all that. Like they're subject to their bad feelings. And for some people, I think religion is really useful in figuring out how to navigate around that. But
sure, then go for it.
Yeah, absolutely. For some people, that's not an option. Like, you don't have the option to be religious because you just don't believe it. So my question was just simply where you in your life have chosen to like seek pleasure and derive happiness and derive meaning and shit like that.
I was pretty young when I picked up a Bible and started studying it. I realized that I was raised Catholic, and I had a lot of issues with some of the church's teachings. And so I decided, I mean, these were people that had studied what they knew for a very long time. Who the hell was I to argue against them unless I'd armed myself with enough to know that. So I've probably read the whole damn thing 3 times, and spent some real time in the Gospels trying to reconcile what was there. Came to terms with it. It's a good book. It's very rich in good philosophy, and if you could lean on that book for a while, even if you ultimately don't end up taking the train to heaven, you will have been enriched by that. And so you want to know that, and you want to know, you got all that crap growing out there. What is it? You at least want to, you'd probably like to be able to identify some of the trees out there. You'd probably like to know which things smell good and which things don't, and what you can eat or nibble on anyway, you know? And you want to, if you see a snake, you want to know whether he's safe to be around. You want to know the world you live in so that you don't worry about things, You know, if you go out in your woods, you're going to pass a copperhead as like as not. And the copperhead is going to remain perfectly still if you don't step on him.
Mm.
And you'll walk right by him and never know he was there. And if you step on him, he might just bite you. And if it's an adult copperhead, there's a really good chance he won't inject any venom.
Mm.
They don't like to waste it. If they pump some venom in you, then they have to recharge before they can hunt. So a lot of the time, if that poisonous snake bites you, it will not really do you any or very much harm. And even if it did, it wouldn't kill you. It's not the people, adult healthy people do not die of copperhead bites. Lots of people are afraid of snakes because they've heard stories about copperheads. It's the only poisonous snake you're going to run into here. There aren't any rattlesnakes out there. But, you know, what is the black rat snake? You run into a black rat snake, if you know what he eats and how he lives his life, you'll start liking seeing him.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yep.
And and there's some real beauties in the little tiny snakes that live out there. Go find a couple. It'll make you happier, you know?
Yeah.
Or when you run across Mr. Toad.
I love Mr. Toad. I never, I've been here for a while and I never see turtles, and I really like them, and I never ever see them.
How close are you to even a little bitty stream?
And it's right down there, real close. Yeah.
They don't like to get a million miles from a stream.
Mm.
But if you've got one right over there, that's good.
Yeah.
I
They
don't
gotta be
see
around.
as many as I used to. I've seen a couple this year, but I used to see them all the time. And especially, you know what's really glorious? A box turtle shell is not quite tall enough for my lawnmower blade to get it. So if I'm mowing tall grass and I run over a turtle, he's terrified, but he ain't hurt.
Hell yeah.
They were designed just beautifully for me.
So you get a lot from nature.
Oh, yeah.
And I house sat for you one time, I guess, and you gave me a fossil, and you've got like all these cool rocks and fossils and crystals and shit around the house.
Yeah.
Where did that passion come? Where did it start, I guess?
Had a guy in junior high school that was a rock collector. I think it ran in the family. And he had a small collection of rocks. And so we started trying to figure out how we could collect some rocks. And then they started up a gem and mineral club locally, and we joined that. This is a charmed life story. We joined the Gem and Mineral Club, and there we met a guy named Harold Henshaw. And I appreciate the fact that you just gave me the opportunity to mention Harold Henshaw's name. Harold Henshaw was a retired scoutmaster, among many other things. And he took me and my buddy Bert all over the state to places where you could find rocks. And we started our collection there. And that was glorious. And he had no reason to give us any time of day. He would always make us each one of us a sandwich that was that Swiss cheese food product and a few pickles. And to this day, I don't like cheese food product, but I like that. I miss that.
Yeah.
But it would have to be a sandwich he made on white bread. And we'd go up there and we'd go into these old mines. And North Carolina's littered with old mines where you can find rocks. It turns out North Carolina has more different kinds of minerals than any other place on Earth the same size.
Really?
Really.
That I didn't know.
Um, Even along the Appalachian Mountains, we've had 3 mountain forming events of note. The first one gave us the taller peaks we've got in the western part of the state. Those mountains, there's a lot of people who don't know this, those mountains were at one time taller than the Himalayas are now.
Huh. How did they get shorter?
Erosion.
Huh.
It was a really, 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 really long time ago. But the Appalachian Mountains and the Alleghenies, as you move north, make an arc that goes all the way across Scotland and into part of Europe. They're really old, and they were part of the giant one continent that the Earth used to have
Right.
before it broke up. And then we had another orogeny that rammed a bunch of, well, every time you have an orogeny, or mountain forming event, you get minerals that are really deep in the soil, and one side or the other gets higher than the ground level. And so you get rocks that are not available to other people because they never got dug up from miles down in some cases. And so there's that one, and then there's the Uaris. And all of them have rocks from deep down in Mother Earth. They found just a couple of diamonds in North Carolina, but they have been found here. And we're good for emeralds and rubies, and we're a very special place. If anybody's interested in rocks, they can slide on out to the fairgrounds. There's the Forsyth County Gem and Mineral Club has a rock show they do every year. They've been doing it for 50 years, and it's one of the best ones in the Southeast, and it costs $2 to get in or something. It costs nothing. They have door prizes, and you can go look at, if you like jewelry, they've got plenty of it. If you just like to look at minerals, that's there too. Thanks for giving me an opportunity to plug them.
Yeah. When does this happen?
September 9th, 10th, and 11th.
Really?
Yeah.
That worked out so well. That's crazy.
Yeah.
We didn't even plan that.
Nope.
Damn. It must have been in the...
You were dang fool enough to ask me to come over and talk to you.
Why is Pilot Mountain standing there all by itself?
Erosion.
So it was more mountains around it, and is that all that's left?
Actually, a little above the top of Pilot Mountain was how high the dirt was for a while.
Oh.
It was flat.
Oh.
And Pilot Mountain was the hardest pile of dirt.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
You remember me telling you that the mountains were as tall as the Himalayas?
Uh-huh.
All that erosion, all the dirt came down this way, and it all got lifted up. And Pilot Mountain and the other Saratown Mountains. Pilot Mountain is not a mountain. It's called a monadnock. And a monadnock is just that. It's an individual mountain. It's not part of a range or anything. And it's just the hardest place the dirt was, and the water ran around it.
Interesting. So that explains it.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, I think someone told me recently. I mean, like when you were talking about how old the Appalachian Mountains are they like some of the older mountains in the world? That
Yes.
whole mountain range.
Yes.
Are they number one, or just in the top?
I don't think that question can be answered yet,
I gotcha. Okay.
but they're very old. The real part is that they got really, really big, and a mountain range that wasn't as big may be gone altogether now, you know, and so we don't really know all of the geology yet. We're still learning, but I could have spent 3 hours or more of my time just talking about the geology of North Carolina.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating.
I think I kind of wish. I mean, that would be a really good conversation to have. I think next time we do this, that's what we should.
Oh,
do.
you're assuming I'll ever come back?
I hope so. If I haven't scared you off with all my communist jargon, my
No,
whatever.
the world is boring if you don't have people that disagree with you.
I agree. Or do I? I disagree.
There you go.
A teacher in school once said, you just like to argue. And I said, no, I don't. And he said, see what I mean? I was like, you bastard. Last question, because I've been talking to so many people about gardens. What do you, I feel like when I talk to people, they have like a main thing. For me, when I started this little teeny tiny garden, I was like most excited about growing pumpkins. And I'm sure it changes over the years. I know.
Why pumpkins? Why pumpkins?
I don't know. I just think they're so interesting. I like their personality. And also, I think like I am interested in the fact that we grow so many pumpkins and don't eat them. And I think like I'm intrigued by maybe trying to find more uses for them in like my diet or whatever.
Okay.
For that time of the year where they're around, because they're not always, but anyway, you get the idea. Do you have like a main thing, like a main, fruit, vegetable, whatever?
Is my garden centered around anything?
Yeah, or just whatever you enjoy the most, like growing.
I'm really fond of tomatoes because I've been successful with them. And some years I have the rest of my garden is good, and some years not. A couple of years back I had a very poor tomato crop. But tomatoes I love. Squash, summer squash and winter squash. I love both of them. And I'm trying really hard to get somehow good at the broccoli and cabbage family. They have an advantage that many of them can overwinter. You can still have fresh things out of your garden,
Right.
all year round.
Which you'd make a good winter gardener, I suppose, right?
Better I am a summer gardener.
Yeah.
I love the cold weather.
Yeah.
And the weeds don't. And so we get along fine. But I like that. I like to try. One of the things that's always appealing to me, sure, you can plant pumpkins out there, or you can plant this pumpkin. You know?
You like to find like the variety that for you or whatever? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. One of the things about me in gardens is when the corn comes in, they start being 20 cents an ear after a while, you know, or the moral equivalent nowadays. When the local gardens are producing, the regular stuff is cheap, but you don't have to do that. I've got chocolate beauty peppers and gypsy peppers, which are both in the bell pepper family. They're not hot. And the chocolate beauties are really about as close to brown as you can imagine, all shiny and brown, and they keep their color when you cook them, and they're delicious. And the gypsies, they're ivory colored with a blush of orange when you do those. They're also really pretty. And they don't taste quite like a green bell pepper, but they're in that family, and because they're not hot, I can serve them to Diana all day long. And you know, Diana likes a little bit of sparkle in her food, but she doesn't like a ton of it.
Yeah.
And I've got some poblano peppers down there. Have you done poblanos?
I grew some, but they're like this big. They like
Mine get about yay long.
Yeah, mine did not get close, and I noticed with both my pepper plants, I've got bell peppers and poblanos out there, and I mean, I kind of started my garden a little late. Maybe that's what it was, but they just kind of chilled after a while, and then just in the last 2 weeks, all of a sudden, have been like flowering and acting like they're about to produce. They want to produce a whole lot more fruit. So maybe it was just because we had a really hot summer, but they weren't cooperating much for a while there.
If we can hold off the first hard frost, you'll probably get some.
Okay, that's what I'm gonna try.
And you can pick them young; it won't hurt them.
Gotcha.
So I like to plant unusual things. I've got 2 kinds of pole beans I grow. This year it's rattlesnake beans and Grandma Nettie's mushroom beans. Both of them are just beans. The rattlesnakes are green beans. They're mottled with purple. They taste like green beans, except just a little different, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Not really what you'd brag about, but they're a little musky or something. I don't know. I've been growing those for some time. And the Grandma Nettie's I grew a long time ago, and then I remembered them this year. They're yellow, and they keep their color. And both of those are not too stringy, and I grew them up on the. I told you could come out and take a look at my trellises. Those are growing on a trellis, although they're spent for this year. Although I've got beans on those plants that would be a good source of bean seeds.
Cool.
So we can do that.
Hell yeah.
Even those kind of beans you can save. You can pick them for seeds, or you can pick them and dry them and eat them as dried beans.
Right.
They don't mind that at all. So I do those. We always try melons and always fail. Never been able to get the melons to work.
Not even watermelon?
Diana's not fond of watermelons.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of sure I can grow a cantaloupe. Or I actually have a thing about cantaloupes because I grew them one year and I got these cantaloupes and I had a lot of them. And before any of them got ripe, the groundhogs got them.
Oh, man.
I didn't get a single one of them.
That'll ruin your day.
It did. To this day, that's the only kind of animal that Diana approves of me shooting.
Really? Yeah. I have a mole that's like digging around underneath my garden, and I don't really know. Like, I haven't seen any evidence that it has fucked up anything, but I can tell that it's going right.
Are you sure it's a mole?
No, I'm not sure.
I haven't had a bad problem this year, but I have often had an invasion of voles. A vole looks very like a mole, except that it doesn't have the hard digging equipment in the front paws and that funny nose that most moles have. Well, if it's a mole, it's eating bugs. They're carnivorous, and voles are vegetarians.
Ah.
I had a whole crop of all purple sweet potatoes one year, and I was pulling out, when I got time to harvest them, I was pulling out little pieces of peppers or of potatoes that would have been this long. I didn't really get any, other than the greens. I didn't really have anything to eat out of those. You can eat sweet potato greens. Okay.
Well, okay. I think we covered everything.
Oh, sure. Invite me over and then run me off.
Nah, we might go look at the garden a little. I don't know, but I guess formally I'll shut it down, and we'll probably just talk more.
Okay.
I don't know, but Trey, thank you for coming and doing this, and for showing me this mushroom from my yard. Appreciate it.
I had fun. Good. I really did.
That's what I'm hoping for.
I didn't know what to think when I came up here.